Welcome to the Eternal format, the unofficial format where every set is legal, from the original base set to the most recent set, with a ban list to keep things balanced. To learn more about the Eternal format, check the links in the description. First, we're going to be looking at Charizard EX with Telepass, which is a list that was built and played in this game by Piano Like Pete. The main attacker in this deck is, of course, Charizard EX. You may be familiar with it from Standard. It has an ability that allows you to attach 3 basic fire energies from your deck to your Pokemon in any way you like when you play it from your hand to evolve one of your Pokemon. And it also has a very good attack for just 2 fire energies. It does 180 damage plus 30 more for each prize card your opponent has taken. And last but not least, it also has 330 HP, which is quite a lot. Charizard EX is a very solid card, and in the Eternal format it has been built with, in a lot of ways. It has been built with Miraidon together with Charmander, Delta species that has the Lightning type. It has been built with Shining Celebi, which is a package that is also included in this list. It has been built with the Inteleon engine, and this list incorporates the Kirlia engine. Kirlia was in Standard not too long ago. It has the Refinement ability, which allows you once during your turn to discard 1 card from your hand and draw 2 cards. And Kirlia is particularly strong because of its evolutions, most notably Gardevoir. Gardevoir has the Telepass Poké Power, which allows you once during your turn to choose a supporter card in your opponent's discard pile, and use its effect as the effect of that Poké Power. You cannot use more than 1 Telepass Poké Power each turn, but it's still really strong, especially if your opponent does not play around it properly. As a nice bonus, we also have Gallade, which has the Buddy Catch ability, which allows you once during your turn to get a supporter card from your deck into your hand. Next, we're going to be looking at Slowking Box. This is still the unpolished list I played in another game I showed on this channel. In fact, this game was played on the same day as that one. The gist of this deck is that with Slowking, we can discard the top card of our deck, and if it's a Pokemon without a rulebox, we can copy its attacks just for 1 Psychic and 1 colorless. We can control the top card of our deck in various different ways. We have Oranguru's ability, which switches 1 card in our hand with the top card of our deck. We have Oracle, and we have Max Revive. And the attackers that we can copy are Guzzlord to take extra prizes, Yveltal to take knockouts on whatever comes in our path, and Kyurem and Raikou to snipe the bench. So, moving on now to the game, my opponent, Piano Like Pete, went first, and he started with 2 Charmander. Charmander, it's worth noting, has the Reprisal attack, which does 20 damage for each damage counter on this Pokemon, which is why Shining Celebi is included in this list. Shining Celebi has an ability that allows your evolved Pokemon to use the attacks of their pre-evolution. Meanwhile, I started with Slowpoke. So, he went first and did nothing, just passed. And we can see why if we flip the board here. He has a lot of supporters in his hand, so literally he could not do anything on his first turn, which is a bit uncharacteristic from this deck. Usually this deck does not break. But anyway, I started my first turn, and I played Quick Ball, discarding Raikou to get Ditto Prism Star. Ditto Prism Star has the ability Almighty Evolution, which allows it to evolve into any stage 1 Pokemon. The catch is that it is a Prism Star Pokemon, so you can only play 1 in your deck, and it goes to the Lost Zone instead of the discard pile. And then I pass. So, on his next turn, my opponent played Arven, which allows him to get an item and a Pokemon tool from their deck, and they get a Buddy-Buddy Poffin and a Muscle Band. Then they play Buddy-Buddy Poffin immediately to get 2 basic Pokemon with 70 HP or less from the deck straight onto their bench. And they grab Ralts and Manaphy. It's worth looking at these Ralts here because of its first attack, Future Sight, which allows you to look at the top 5 cards of either player's deck and put them back on top in any order you want. This Ralts is relevant because it can really slow down your opponent in certain cases. Then again they pass. So my turn, I draw another Slowpoke, which I put onto my bench, and I evolve Ditto Prism Star into Claydol, which is one of the most powerful draw engines in this format. It has a Poké Power, Cosmic Power, which allows you to put up to 2 cards from your hand to the bottom of your deck in any order you want, and then if you do, you draw cards until you have 6 in your hand. So that's what I do. And I draw Oranguru, which, like I mentioned in the intro, allows me to switch a card from my hand with the top card of my deck, which I do by putting Kyurem on top of my deck. Kyurem, which is here for the Trifrost attack, which does 110 damage to 3 of my opponent's Pokemon, but I have to discard all energy. I draw an Iono, which is a draw supporter that I am a bit scared to play here for 2 reasons. First, it also refreshes my opponent's hand, and my opponent's hand is quite bricky. Second, I'm playing against Telepass, and I really do not want to give a free Iono every turn to my opponent. And so I decide to just pass. Then my opponent plays a Professor Kukui, which allows him to draw 2 cards, and during this turn his Pokemon's attacks do 20 more damage to my active. They find a Kirlia, rather they already had Kirlia in hand, so they use Refinement, discarding Muscle, and then drawing 2 cards. They find a Level Ball, with which they can find a Pokemon with 90 HP or less, and they choose a Charmeleon, and then he ends his turn. On my turn, I use Claydol again to draw a few more cards, and I find a Buddy-Buddy Poffin, with which I get a Baltoy and Minun into play. Minun is similar to Phazon DPTX, if you are familiar with Standard. It has a Poké Power, which allows you to draw 2 cards if one of your Pokemon was knocked out during your opponent's last turn. It is 1 fewer card compared to Phazon DPTX or Raikou GX, but this is a single price Pokemon, so this is why I prefer it. And also I can get it with Poffin. With Oranguru again, I put Kyurem on top of my deck, but I just found another Oranguru, so I just pass. Then my opponent again uses Kirlia, discarding Shining Celebi to draw 2 cards, and then they play Evolution Incense to get an evolution Pokemon, in this case Charizard DX, from their deck. And then they evolve their benched Charmeleon into the Charizard DX, and thanks to the ability they can get up to 3 basic fire energy from their deck, in this case 2, and they chose to attach them to Charizard. Then they attach from hand 1 energy to Charmander to retreat, and now they're ready to attack for plenty enough to knock out my Slowpoke. So, my turn again. I attach a basic energy to Slowpoke. I draw a few cards with Claydol. Still don't find a way to get Slowking in play. With Oranguru, again, I put an attacker on top of my deck. In this case, it was Yveltal. And I find Oracle, which I decide to play in order to put 2 cards on top of my deck. And in this case, I put another Claydol and Dimension Valley. And then with Minun, I draw into those 2 cards. Then I put my second Claydol into play, so I can draw even more cards. I still don't find my Slowking, which is a bit of a shame, because I could have attacked with it this turn, because Dimension Valley would have reduced the cost of its attack by 1 colorless, so it would have just cost 1 Psychic, and the Psychic energy was already attached here. So, with nothing better to do, I attack with the Slowpoke, which puts Charizard DX to sleep. And my opponent flipped tails, so Charizard stayed asleep. Then my opponent played Pokemon Communication to shuffle Charmander from his hand back into the deck and get Charizard DX. With Super Rod, they recover Fire Energy and Shining Celebi, shuffling them back into his deck. And then he plays a Rare Candy in order to get another Charizard DX into play. And finally they play Guzma, getting the Charizard that is not asleep in the active spot, and getting my Claydol, which evolved from Ditto Prison Star, into the active spot. With Kirlia, they draw a few more cards, and they find Evolution Incense, with which they get Telepass online. And with Telepass, they can copy the effect of my Oracle. So they put Steven's Advisor, which is a powerful draw supporter, and Buddy-Buddy Poffin on top of the deck. And then finally they attack, taking another knockout, and my Ditto Prison Star goes to the last zone. Here I draw yet another attacker, namely Guzzlord, which is not exactly what I need right now. But anyway, I attach a Gift Energy to Slowpoke, and with Claydol I draw a couple more cards, and finally I have a way of finding Slowking, namely Luxury Ball. Luxury Ball allows you to get any Pokemon from your deck except Pokemon level X and put it into your hand, but you can only play it if you have no other Luxury Ball in your discard pile. So pretty much all decks in this format play this card as a one-off. So first I draw a couple cards with Minun, and then I get my Slowking with Luxury Ball. I then put a couple cards on top of my deck with Oracle, namely Slowking and Max Revive. I play Prime Catcher, with which I cast Gardevoir. Prime Catcher also tells me to switch my active Pokemon with one of my bench ones, and I switched into Oranguru, which had a Float Stone attached, which gives it a free retreat, and then retreated back into Slowking. Now with Oranguru, I put Guzzlord on top of my deck, getting instead the Slowking that I stuck there with Oracle. And I can now attack with Seek Inspiration. So I discard the top card of my deck, which is a Guzzlord, and choose an attack on it, which is a Red Banquet, which does 120 and takes one additional prize card in case of a knockout. Gardevoir here has 110 HP, and also weakness to Psychic, which is Slowking's type, so the knockout does indeed happen, and they take 2 prize card. My opponent then on the turn plays Teammates, which allows him to get any 2 cards they want from his deck, but the card can only be played if I took a knockout during his last turn. And with Teammates they choose to get a Buddy-Buddy Poffin, with which they get 2 Rals. And the Level Ball, which they do not use right away. And then he attacks, knocking out my Slowking. Now, Slowking had Gift Energy attached, so while the knockout takes place, I can draw cards until I have 7 in my hand. So here comes the Max Revive I put there with Oracle, plus Basic Energy. And I promote Slowpoke. So I attach the energy to Slowpoke and evolve it into Slowking. I have Baltoy on my bench. I play Poffin just to thin my hand down without getting anything. Then I draw a couple cards with Minun. I find a Quick Ball, with which I get Yveltal. I play Max Revive to put a Pokemon from my discard pile on top of my deck, namely Slowpoke, which I will draw into now with Claydol. So I put that Slowpoke onto my bench. Then I play Steven's Advice, which allows me to draw a number of cards up to the number of Pokemon my opponent has in play, which in this case is 6 cards. You can only play this card if you have at most 6 cards in your hand, including this card. The text printed on this card says 7, not 6, but there is an errata and a newer print of this card which has the correct text. So I draw my 6 cards. With Oranguru I put Yveltal on top of my deck. Funnily enough, there was another Yveltal already on there, so my hand essentially stays the same. And I can use Seek Inspiration because Dimension Valley is still in play. So I knock out Charizard DX, getting 2 prize cards. My opponent promotes Radiant Charizard, which can essentially attack for just 1 energy now, since I've taken 4 prize cards. And they bump my stadium with Pokemon Tower, which prevents me, or both players actually, from recovering cards from the discard pile to their hand with any Pokemon Power, attack, energy card, or trainer card, essentially. This is mainly a counter to Versus Seeker, which is a good way to play around Telepass. However, since this is a very unpolished list that I'm playing, there are actually no Versus Seekers in here. Anyway, they then play Power Hand Extension, which is a card that is similar to Counter Catcher. You can only play it if you have more prizes remaining than your opponent, and it gives you a choice. You can either move an energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon to one of their bench ones, or you can use the same effect as Counter Catcher, so essentially a Gust. And in this case, they Gust my Claydol. With the Level Ball they get Kirlia, which can draw them a few cards, but before they do that they play N to lower my hand size to just 2. They find another Kirlia, they draw a few cards with Refinement, but they do not find and energy. They do find a PAL pad, which they use to recover a couple supporters. They use PAL pad because the Pokemon Tower prevents them from playing versus Seeker. Actually, 2 PAL pads. And yeah, then he ends his turn. So, here with Claydol, I can just rebuild my hand, since luckily it did not get knocked out. I find the Floatstone and an energy to attack with Slowking. Then I considered playing a Quick Ball, but then did not. I retreated into Slowking, and I attacked using actually Slowking's second attack, Super Psybolt, which ordinarily does 120 damage, but that damage is actually reduced by Double Rainbow Energy. Double Rainbow Energy is a special energy which can only be attached to evolution Pokemon that are not Pokemon EX, that's lowercase EX. Evolved Pokemon, not evolution, my bad. And it provides 2 energy of any type, but it reduces the attack done by 10. So Super Psybolt does 110 damage. And I did this instead of using Quick Ball to get an attacker and then putting it on top of my deck with Oranguru, because there was not much point in knocking out Radiant Charizard now, to then have to take another surprise knockout on Charizard DX later. So instead I chose to get Radiant Charizard in range for a possible knockout with Guzzlord. So my opponent had another N, so back down to 2 cards and goes my hand. Then with Kirlia, he draws a few more cards. He finds Heroescape, which gives Radiant Charizard 100 more HP, crucially putting it outside of the range of a KO with Red Banquet. Then he plays Gugus Attack, which says all Pokemon powers stop working until the end of your opponent's next turn. So essentially we'll be unable to use both Minun's Pokepower and Claydol's Pokepower. So even though those 2 Pokemon remain on my board, they are essentially useless. And then he ends his turn. Lucky for me, I have enough tools to win here. First I play Faba to remove the Heroescape and put it into the Lost Zone. And then I play Max Revive to put Guzzlord on top of my deck. So now Seek Inspiration allows me to win the game by taking the last 2 prize cards. So, Slowking managed to win this game, despite all the tricks that Charizard had up its sleeve. I think this was mostly due to 3 factors. First, the fact that my opponent had an uncharacteristic British start. Second, the fact that I managed to take out his Gardevoir. And third, the fact that he had no energy cards in the deck at the end of the game, although there was still a Super Rod in there. Pianoleg Pete, after this game, told me that he wanted a 6th energy in the deck, maybe cutting Shining Celebi for it. It is worth noting that we did start playing another game with this list before this one, though unfortunately we could not finish it because of technical issues. In that game my opponent did not break, and I wasn't really playing around Telepass, so Charizard would have won that game very easily. Since this was an old game, we can look at how Pianoleg Pete updated this list. He did indeed remove Shining Celebi, thus changing the Charmander as well. Then he also removed 1 Kirlia and Radiant Charizard, opting instead for a few tech options like Ditto from Triumphant, Faba, and Stealthy Hood. He did not end up adding the 6th energy. As far as updates to my Slowking list go, there are no major ones. I removed Raikou, which was redundant with Kyurem already in the list, and I replaced it with a much needed versus Seeker. I also introduced a split in the choice of Slowpoke and also of Baltoy, and that's about it for now. I'd say this list still isn't polished, but I haven't worked much on it. So, with that being said, thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions about the game or the lists, feel free to comment below. Thanks again to Pianoleg Pete for playing this game, and I'll see you next time.